The first time the officers saw John George carry the rifle into camp, they thought it was a joke. Not the kind men laugh at when they are comfortable. The other kind. The kind soldiers use when something looks so out of place that mocking it feels safer than asking why it is there. It was late 1942. Guadalcanal was already stripping men down to the truth. Rain, mud, heat, insects, exhaustion, and a jungle so thick it felt like it was hiding thoughts, not just enemies. And into that place John George brought a rifle that looked like it belonged somewhere else entirely. He had just opened a crate that had followed him across the ocean through military mail. Inside was a Winchester Model 70, bolt action, polished wood, scope mounted on top. Not Army issue, not standard, not welcome. One officer looked at the rifle, then at George, and asked if he planned to hunt deer between battles. Another called it a sporting toy. A third laughed and said the lieutenant had ordered himself a sweetheart through the mail. That was the line that stuck. So did the nickname. The mail-order rifle. And in a regiment preparing to fight in the jungle, that name was not affectionate. It was an accusation, because on Guadalcanal anything that looked different felt suspicious. Anything civilian looked weak. Anything slow looked dangerous to the man carrying it. The M1 Garand was the rifle of the American infantryman. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, fast, reliable, aggressive, a real battlefield weapon. George's Winchester held 5. Every shot needed the bolt. Every follow-up demanded calm hands. To most officers, that meant only one thing. The rifle belonged anywhere except a war zone. Captain Morris made that clear almost immediately. He told George, in the flat voice officers use when they expect obedience, to leave the thing behind and carry a proper weapon. George did what soldiers sometimes do when they hear an order they believe is foolish. He nodded, then ignored it. Not because he was trying to be difficult, because John George had not bought that rifle on impulse. He had not ordered it because it looked impressive, and he had not carried it into the Pacific because he wanted attention. He had brought it because long before Guadalcanal, long before jungle combat, long before Japanese snipers began dropping American soldiers from treetops, he had already learned something most armies only respect after blood forces them to. Speed matters. Volume matters. But sometimes one perfect shot matters more than 8 fast ones. George knew that because he was not pretending to be a marksman. He already was one. Before the war, he had won rifle competitions most men never entered, and many expert shooters never won. He understood distance, wind, breathing, trigger pressure, sight picture, patience. All the invisible skills that look unimportant right up until the moment they become the difference between life and death. But armies do not always reward invisible skill immediately. Sometimes they laugh at it first. And on Guadalcanal, they laughed plenty, at least until the Point Cruz Grove started killing men. At first, the deaths came one at a time. A soldier near a creek, filling canteens, shot before anyone even knew where to look. Then a patrol losing a man without ever seeing the muzzle flash. Then another body on a jungle path. Then another. Then more. The Japanese snipers were not firing wildly. They were not wasting ammunition. They were choosing moments. A man stepped into the open. A man paused too long. A man bent to lift a crate. A man raised his head just a little too high. That was enough. The Americans had already seen brutal fighting on Guadalcanal. Machine gun nests, bunkers, artillery. But hidden rifle fire was different, because a bunker gives you something to hate. A sniper in a tree gives you doubt, and doubt spreads faster than panic. Soon every branch looked occupied, every patch of shadow looked intentional, every silence felt staged. The Point Cruz Groves did not just kill men, they changed the way men moved, the way they looked at the jungle, the way they slept. Because once hidden rifle fire enters a man's mind, the terrain stops feeling like terrain. It starts feeling like a trap. By the 3rd day, the officers who had joked about George's scoped rifle were no longer joking. Now they were counting dead. Now they were measuring routes and risk. Now they were realizing that the standard answers were failing. Patrols had gone out. Searches had been made. Men had fired back into leaves and darkness. Searches had been made. Men had fired back into leaves and darkness. None of it had ended the killing. And that was when John George's ridiculous rifle stopped looking ridiculous. It started looking possible, not in money, in value. The battalion commander wanted results, not opinions, not pride, not another speech about what a proper American officer should carry into battle. He wanted the snipers gone. So suddenly, the question was no longer why George had brought the rifle. The question was whether it could do what everyone else's weapons had not. That shift matters. Because mockery is easy, dependence is heavier. Before, the rifle made George look foolish. Now the same rifle carried something far more dangerous than ridicule. Expectation. George did not turn the moment into a speech. He did not remind anyone how often they had laughed. He did not force anybody to apologize. There is a certain type of man who becomes quieter when other people are finally forced to admit he might have been right. John George seems to have been that kind of man. When he was called in, the room no longer cared about appearances, only results. Could he find the hidden shooters? Could he outweight them? Could he place one careful round where all the standard firepower had failed? George already knew what most of them were only beginning to understand. Some problems are not solved with more noise. Some enemies cannot be beaten by volume. Some battlefields demand patience before aggression. And near Point Cruz, patience had become a weapon. The officers looked at the man they had mocked. They looked at the rifle they had dismissed. And beneath all the formal language, the real question hung in the air. Can you stop the killing? George did not hesitate. He did not inflate the moment. He did not perform confidence. He answered the way only a man answers when his certainty comes from skill instead of ego. Yes, that one word carried everything. The competitions before the war, the hours behind a rifle, the discipline to ignore ridicule, the refusal to abandon what he knew would matter, the understanding that one shot in the right hands could change everything. Because saying yes did not mean glory. It meant responsibility. It meant entering a contest of patience against men who had already turned the jungle into a weapon. It meant that if he failed, more Americans would die. And if he succeeded, the same men who had mocked the mail-order rifle would have to admit that the battlefield had chosen a different answer than they had. The jungle remained the same, wet, silent, watchful, but something had changed, not in the trees. In the balance, the rifle that entered camp as a joke was no longer a joke. Now it was a last chance, and somewhere in the Point Cruz groves, hidden in leaves and branches and silence, the snipers were waiting. So was John George, and now for the first time nobody was laughing. George did not celebrate after saying yes. He did not leave the command post looking satisfied, because satisfaction had nothing to do with it. The men already dead near Point Cruz were beyond pride. What mattered now was whether the killing could be stopped. By then, the groves had already changed the battalion. Men crossed open ground faster. They stopped lingering near tree lines. They looked upward without meaning to. They slept badly. They moved as if the jungle itself had learned how to aim. That was the true power of the Japanese snipers. Not just that they could kill, that they could make every branch feel occupied, every silence feel planned. George understood that fear, but he also understood something more useful. The snipers were not ghosts. They were disciplined riflemen, patient men using height, concealment, and timing better than anyone sent against them so far. And skill, unlike mystery, can be answered. So George took his Winchester and moved toward Point Cruz, not like a hero walking into legend, like a marksman going to work, quietly, carefully, without wasting motion. The others had gone into those groves, searching for enemies. George went in searching for errors. A hidden sniper does not reveal himself because someone wants him to. He reveals himself when something about the concealment stops matching the world around it. A line too straight, a shadow too solid, a branch carrying weight it should not carry, a gap in the leaves that gives a man just enough view of the trail below. Most soldiers under pressure look too fast. They want a full body, a clear rifle, a visible face. But a concealed rifleman survives by never offering those things. George knew he had to look for intention, not appearance. He studied where a shooter would want to sit, where he could watch movement without exposing himself, where he could fire and vanish back into the trees. The groves were thick, hot, and deceptive. Light broke apart in the canopy and fell in pieces, Branches crossed each other like traps. Vines turned depth into confusion. Mud dragged at boots. Insects crawled over sleeves and hands. The jungle was always touching a man, distracting him, asking him to move. George refused. He found a place to wait. Then he did the hardest thing combat can ask. He stayed still. Stillness sounds simple until death may be watching. Your lungs feel loud. Your pulse feels visible. Every muscle wants to shift, but one unnecessary movement is all a patient sniper needs. George let the jungle move first. Leaves trembled. Light shifted. Nothing. Then more nothing. The hidden shooter was waiting for impatience. George did not help him. Minutes passed. Heat settled deeper into cloth and skin. Sweat moved down his neck. Insects kept working. Still he watched, not staring, observing. The competitions before the war returned to him then. The hours behind a rifle, the discipline to hold breath, thought, and movement in order until the eye had earned the shot. Most men think marksmanship begins when the trigger is touched. Real marksmanship begins long before that. It begins in refusal. Refusal to guess. Refusal to hurry. Refusal to fire at hope. Then something changed, a small wrongness in the branches. A darker shape inside the leaves. George did not rush. He kept watching until uncertainty hardened into knowledge. Then the rifle came into perfect alignment. Breath settled, pressure built. The Winchester cracked once, only once, and a body fell out of the tree. For days, the snipers had felt almost untouchable. Men had fired back into leaves and shadows and come away with nothing but more doubt. But now doubt had weight. A dead man on the ground. The hidden killer was no longer a rumor in the branches. He was proof that the trees could give their secrets up. Word spread quickly. The men heard that George had taken the rifle they mocked into Point Cruz and pulled a sniper out of the canopy with one shot. That matters, because fear grows strongest when the enemy seems beyond reach. The moment he bleeds, something changes, but enough to break the spell. George did not stop there. One sniper position teaches you how another mind might think. The first success did not make him reckless. It made him more precise. Now he knew what kind of perch these men preferred. What kind of concealment gave them sight of the trails below. The groves no longer looked random. They looked readable. He moved again. Slowly, carefully. He studied another section of trees. Another tangle of branches. Another stretch of silence thick enough to hide a rifleman. Again he waited. Again the jungle tried to drown him in false signals. A knot in wood that looked like a helmet. A bent branch that resembled a shoulder. A shadow that seemed occupied until light changed and erased it. That is how fear defeats ordinary men. It makes them shoot too early or doubt too late. George did neither. He kept searching for that one small fracture in the pattern. Then he found it. Another hint of human choice buried inside natural disorder. Another place where concealment felt too deliberate. He settled in. Watched longer. Confirmed. Then fired. The second sniper went down. After that, nobody could call it luck. Now it was method. Now the mail-order rifle had become the most serious weapon in the grove. The officers who had mocked the scope no longer mocked it. The soldiers who had laughed at the polished wood now heard the same rifle was dropping hidden killers from the trees. No speech could have changed their minds the way those shots did. War respects results more than it respects doctrine. Near Point Cruz, results were rewriting the argument. The change went deeper than reputation. It changed morale. A unit under sniper pressure does not only need tactics. It needs proof that the enemy can be answered. Without that proof, fear becomes atmosphere. George was giving the battalion something it had almost lost. Belief. Not blind belief. Earned belief. The Japanese snipers had turned the trees into a source of terror. George was turning those same trees into evidence. Evidence that the enemy could be seen. Evidence that patience could be answered with greater patience. And flesh and bone can fall. By now, the men around him were beginning to understand something they should have understood the day the crate was opened. A battlefield does not care what a weapon looks like. It cares about usefulness. Can the weapon solve the problem in front of you? At Point Cruz, the Winchester could, because John George could. He had endured the mockery, ignored the order to leave it behind, carried the rifle through the laughter, and now the battlefield itself was forcing everyone around him to admit what they had refused to see. The wrong rifle had become the right answer. The strange officer had become the man hunting the hunters, and in the Point Cruz groves, the balance was beginning to shift. Not loudly, not cleanly, but unmistakably. The Japanese snipers were no longer the only patient men in the trees. Now someone was watching back. Someone with a scope. Someone with discipline. Someone who understood that one perfect shot, delivered at exactly the right moment, could change the way an entire battalion breathed. John George had entered camp as a joke. Near Point Cruz, he was becoming proof. By the time word spread through the battalion, John George was no longer the officer with the ridiculous rifle. He was the man the jungle had finally stopped laughing at. That change did not happen because of speeches. It did not happen because rank intervened. It happened because dead snipers began falling out of trees. And in war, that is the only kind of argument nobody can talk over. The Point Cruz groves were still dangerous. Still wet, still silent in the wrong ways, still packed with shadows that could hide a rifleman long enough to choose a target and end a life. But something inside the balance had shifted. The Americans were no longer walking through those trees, believing the enemy owned every unseen angle. Now they knew the hidden men could be found. They could be watched. They could be killed. That mattered more than comfort, more than pride, more than the officers ever wanted to admit. Because the real humiliation was not that they had mocked a rifle. The real humiliation was that the rifle had understood the battlefield before they did. John George kept working. He let the results speak and returned to the trees in silence. And the more he worked, the clearer the lesson became. The jungle did not care what a proper military rifle was supposed to look like. It did not care what the officers preferred. It did not care about doctrine spoken in safe voices far from the trees. It cared about vision, discipline, stillness, patience, the ability to read one small lie inside 1,000 honest branches. George had that ability. Long before Guadalcanal, long before Point Cruz, long before men started dying in ways that forced everyone around him to understand what skill actually looked like. That is why this story matters. Not because one officer brought an unusual rifle to war, because he trusted a hard-earned truth, even while other men laughed at it. Most people can hold on to their judgment when it is praised. Very few can hold on to it when it is mocked by everyone around them. George did. He endured the smirks, the nickname, the order to leave the rifle behind. He carried it anyway, quietly, without a speech, without a scene, and when the moment came, the battlefield itself proved him right. That is usually how real ability works. It does not beg to be believed. It waits. Then reality does the talking. By the end, the mail-order rifle no longer sounded like an insult. It sounded like a confession that the joke had been on the wrong men all along. The officers had seen polished wood and a civilian scope and assumed weakness. The jungle had seen precision and called it necessary. That difference cost blood. War punishes lazy certainty. It punishes the habit of mistaking familiarity for superiority. It punishes men who mock what they do not yet understand. And sometimes, if they survive long enough, it teaches them better. Point Cruz taught them. It taught them that not every answer comes wrapped in standard issue. That speed is not always the same as effectiveness. That one disciplined man can alter the morale of an entire battalion if he breaks the enemy's illusion of safety. That hidden killers remain mortal the moment somebody patient enough begins hunting back. For the soldiers moving through those groves, George became more than a marksman. He became proof that the fear could be answered. Proof that the trees did not belong only to the enemy. Proof that the next silence did not automatically mean another body. In war, proof like that is a weapon. Sometimes it is the weapon behind the weapon. The thing that steadies a man's breathing when he has to step forward again. And maybe that is the deepest reason John George's story survived. Because it is not only about a rifle. It is about the lonely strength required to trust what you know while everyone around you mistakes it for foolishness. It is about carrying the right answer before the world is desperate enough to recognize it. It is about the moment ridicule turns into reliance. John George entered Guadalcanal as the officer with the wrong rifle. He left Point Cruz as the man who made the jungle give up its secrets. The same men who once saw a joke in his hands now saw survival. The same rifle they called a toy had become the reason hidden snipers were no longer untouchable, and that is why his story still lingers. Because every battlefield, every institution, every group of confident men eventually meets someone they underestimate for the wrong reason. The question is never whether that mistake will be made. The question is how much blood will be spilled before anyone admits it. So when the next strange answer appears, the next quiet expert is mocked. The next man carrying the wrong tool is told to fall in line. Who will remember John George before the bodies do?